Our passage for this evening will come from Mark chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. Mark 4, 35 through 41. On that day when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us go across to the other side." And leaving the crowd, they took him with them in the boat, just as he was. And other boats were with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves were breaking into the boat, so that the boat was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on the cushion. And they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And he awoke and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. He said to them, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great fear and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" This passage that we read here is a great principle for all of us, because many times in life we often find ourselves in positions in which it feels as if we are sinking. It feels as if the water is just coming over us. And all that happens is we just sink and we sink and we sink. And so these words that they say to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" are words not just for these disciples here, but words that we could easily cry to God today. Because our circumstances, whether personal circumstances, sometimes cultural circumstances, often feels as if we're just sinking. And the waves keep coming in on us. And they are not stopping. And I think even if we don't say this kind of thing aloud, this is something that we often think. God, don't you care that we're perishing? Don't you care that our culture is as it is, or our close-knit society is as it is, or maybe my personal circumstances are as they are? God, don't you care? And so what I'd like us to do is to go through this passage, and we are going to go through it first from the disciples' perspective and kind of see what their perspective was in this passage here, in this section. And then I'd like to go through it as examining it from God's perspective. And then I'd like to look at really what the issue is that's being addressed and what we can take away from this. So first, examining this from the disciples' perspective. The disciples are with Jesus. Jesus has been teaching. You see this earlier in chapter 4. And then Jesus in verse 35 tells the disciples, "Let us go across to the other side." And so they get into these boats. It's in the plural too. There's more than one boat. And so they begin to go to the other side, and that's when a great storm of some kind rushes upon them, and the waves begin to fill the boat, and they cry out, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And I'd like to point out first that as we read through the Gospels, this is very consistent in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that this is the first time the disciples' lives are in danger on account of Jesus. This is the first time that they've obeyed Jesus, because you see, it is Jesus's command. In verse 35, "Let us go across the other side." It's his idea. And so they go across the other side, and on the way, they encounter this storm. And so this is the first time, as far as we know, that these disciples' lives were in danger in obeying Jesus. And I imagine that must have been very surprising for them. Because when we take a moment and reflect upon what did they think of the Messiah, who did they think the Messiah was going to be? And for them, the Messiah was going to be a very political figure, a powerful figure, an overcoming figure. And yet they're obeying the Messiah, and on the way, their lives are in danger. In fact, they are very scared that they're about to die. And I think this must have been unexpected. And I use that very strongly. This must have been an unexpected thing, that in listening to the Messiah, suddenly their lives are in danger. And of course, we know later on for many of these people, their lives would consistently be in danger. In fact, this would be a recurring theme throughout the lives of many of these Christians. But this is, as far as we know, the first time. And it must have just been shocking that in listening to this person who has these great teachings, who's performing these great miracles, their lives are in danger. And you can't help but think that they must have thought something was wrong. That maybe Jesus isn't who he claims to be. If I were in that situation, that would cross my mind. If I'm obeying this guy and now all of a sudden bad stuff's happening, am I really where I should be? Is this really the Messiah? So as we begin to examine this from the disciples' perspective, I think it is not surprising that they ask this question in verse 38. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? This must have just been shocking to them, that they are about to die because they are obeying what Jesus said in verse 35. So that's the first thing I'd really like us to consider in trying to put ourselves in the shoes of these people, is that they, as far as we know, have not encountered a situation where because of obedience, their lives are in danger. And it must have really taken them off guard and destabilized them and shaken them up in some way. I'd like to point out as well that many of these disciples are fishermen, even sons of fishermen. And the reason I say that is because that means they have a healthy respect for a windstorm and what it can do to people on a boat. I mean, if you grow up as a fisherman, and that's your livelihood, and for some of them, even at least your parents' livelihood, maybe it's, many generations, you probably know people who have drowned. You probably know people who have been in a similar situation, and that was the end for them. And so I don't think their fear is unsurprising. They probably have a very healthy respect and fear for the power of the winds and what they can do to people in a boat. I'd also like, as we examine the disciples' perspective, to take a closer look at this question, because this question is the basis for all of this. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? This is a very loaded question. There's a lot of subtext to this question. This is, in effect, asking God, aren't you paying attention? And there are times, I think, where we want to ask the same thing. God, aren't you watching? Don't you care that we are sinking? Aren't you paying attention? Another way of asking this question is death a little thing to you? Don't you care that I'm going to die? Is my life really that little in your eyes? Another way of asking this is, are you uncompassionate? Are you unmerciful? Are you unmerciful toward my personal weakness, toward my fears? As we begin to examine this from the disciples' perspective, I lastly want to point out that this entire scenario, verses 35 through 41, is a fearful experience. That is the theme of the whole experience. It's fearful. It is first fearful because of the storm. They're afraid. And they wake up Jesus and ask him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" And then Jesus rebukes the wind, tells the sea, "Peace, be still." And then Jesus says to them, verse 40, "Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith?" And how does the passage end in verse 41? They were filled with great fear. They're actually more afraid now than they were before. So the theme of the entire passage is fear. So when we take a moment and try to ask, what were these disciples going through? Why did they ask this question? What was the outcome? This entire scenario is one that is very fearful, that is filled with great fear. It begins with fear, and it ends with greater fear. Now that's going to be kind of the disciples' perspective, so let's hold on to that. We're going to come back to this idea of fear. I now want to ask, what is God's perspective? And I'd like to just start by pointing out that God does have a perspective. And it's not something we should neglect. And in fact, I think it's very healthy for us to contemplate God's perspective of circumstances of the world, of people, of our actions. I think it's a very healthy thing to contemplate God's perspective. And I want to just point out before we get into this, God does have a perspective. And God's perspective can be different than ours. It can disagree with our perspective. It can be an even greater insight than what we can see. And so I'd like to just ask, well, what do we think God's perspective is when we begin to examine this? And I'll point out that maybe, just maybe, God sees this as the first time they're experiencing the trustworthiness of Jesus. That maybe Jesus had he taught a lot of truth. He performed many miracles, but this is the first time when they're really going to experience firsthand Jesus' trustworthiness. When we begin to think of it like that, I think we see it a little bit differently. That maybe this is the first time they were forced to be in a situation where they doubted, and then their doubt was proven to be based on nothing. It was baseless. Because as I said, this is Jesus' idea. In verse 35, he tells them, "Let us go across to the other side." And if we've got our thinking caps on, and in situations where there's a lot of fear and anxiety, it's very hard to have our thinking caps on. But if we've got our thinking caps on, you maybe can take a step back and say, well, Jesus is the Messiah, and Jesus says, let's go across. Like, why would God allow his Messiah to drown? That doesn't make sense. We're going to make it to the other side. And when you begin to kind of think it out, you begin to see sometimes that we overreact in situations in which we shouldn't overreact. Situations which appear fearful, but really God is not only totally in control, but he sees it differently. And so you have this, what I think is maybe a time for them to learn of the trustworthiness of Jesus. And as I said, I believe that from God's perspective, maybe there was a bit of an overreaction. And I think this is why Jesus reprimands them and rebukes them in verse 40. Why are you so afraid? Have you still no faith? Because they overreacted. Now, I think we have a small glimpse into this. If you've ever, been around someone who's afraid of something that you're not afraid of. Maybe it's bugs, maybe it's snakes, maybe it's being in close quarters. If you've ever seen someone who's afraid of something that you're not afraid of, we tend to think to ourselves, this person is overreacting, right? I know the outcome. I know that if this person doesn't move, this bee is not going to sting them. They just settle down. We're okay. There are little things that we maybe are not afraid of, but when other people are afraid, we see them overreacting. And I think in that, when we think about it like that, maybe we have a small glimpse into how God sees this situation. That this storm that is coming in with heavy winds and waves are coming up into the boat. It even says, so that the boat is filling, in verse 37, the boat is filling with water. Things do not look at it. It's not just like a little bit of wind comes in. It's like, if this continues, we will die. That even those situations that we're in, from God's perspective, maybe we're just overreacting. And I think that actually is one of the great lessons we learn here, that God is totally in control. That this enormous power that is creation, that is nature, with these heavy winds, these heavy rains, God's totally in control. And so I think partly from God's perspective, maybe these disciples are overreacting a little bit. And I think all in all, from God's perspective, this is a learning experience. And that's the intention here. That's what's going on here. Not just for them, of course, but for us. That many of these things were written down for our learning. And it's really hard to think of it like that, though, when you're in the moment. When we're in times when it feels like we're drowning, when we're sinking, when the waves are coming in, the boat is filling, it's sometimes hard not to overreact. It's sometimes hard not to be afraid. It's sometimes hard not to wonder, God, do you care that we are perishing? Is my death a little thing in your eyes? And as we begin to see this, of course, the answer is yes, God cares very much that we are perishing. So as we get into this passage, I just wanted to take a moment to first examine it from the disciples' perspective, to show, I think in part, they had good reason to be afraid. But then I also want to examine it from God's perspective to show that maybe they were overreacting a little bit. But I'm not sure any of us would have acted any differently in a situation like this. So what is going on here? What is the big takeaway for us? And I think for us, the big takeaway has to do with the relationship between faith and fear. The relationship between faith and fear, how they relate together, and how we order them in our lives. What are we more afraid of? What do we have more faith in? And I think that is the big takeaway in all of this. This question, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? That's not a bad question to ask. In fact, it's one we're allowed to ask. You read the Psalms. The Psalms are filled with writers who ask the question, God, don't you see? Don't you care? Aren't you merciful? The Psalms are filled with people. I'm going to try to phrase this carefully. The Psalms are filled with people pouring out their heart to God, even their doubts. Now, they're not filled with people cursing God. Right? That's what's wrong. That's what Job's wife told Job to do, to curse God and die. The Psalms are not filled with people cursing God, but they are filled with people questioning God and expressing their doubts. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's a good thing for us to express to God what is on our hearts. But sometimes we ask this question, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? because the relationship between our faith and our fear is out of order. Because the question we should be asking is, what kind of faith are we talking about? When we're talking about faith, we're talking about a trust. And what is it that they are trusting? And they are trusting in the power of something. That is what's going on here. That first they are afraid and they trust that the power of nature is more powerful than they are. In fact, the fact that they asked Jesus to do something, maybe there's even a hint of they trust and fear that this power of nature is more powerful than even God. And maybe God might not be able to do as much as he would like to do. And the answer to all of this is that they end up in the end trusting and fearing God even more. And so when we are in situations when it feels as if the waves are crashing in and the boat is filling with water and we are afraid, we should then immediately ask ourselves, what is my faith in? What do I trust to be more powerful? That which is overpowering me, or God who can overpower that which is overpowering me? This is, I think, a great insight into how our hearts work, how our minds work, and how we function in daily life. This relationship between faith and fear, and really this question of what are we more afraid of? What do we fear more? In fact, the Christian philosopher Søren Kierkegaard had this idea that the way to have courage is to fear more that which you're currently afraid of. So if I'm afraid of, if I'm afraid of talking to someone, I should fear more, the consequence of not talking to someone. If I'm afraid of, people killing me for being a Christian, what is Jesus' answer? Don't fear man, fear God. Like, the way to have courage to go to your death as a Christian is not to be without fear, it's to rightly place our fear and to place it in God. And I think here we have a relationship, and I'm talking about fear and courage, but I want to bring this back to this idea of fear and faith, because fear and faith really go together. What we're afraid of is often an indicator of what we trust in and what we believe can actually happen. And so they are afraid and have this fear of the power of nature. But in seeing Jesus, say to the wind and to the sea, peace be still, they then fear God even more and place their faith in God. As we consider this passage, as I said, this question, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? This is the central question to all of this. And how we answer this question says everything about what we think of God. Does God care that we are perishing? And of course, in the grand scheme of things, of course he does. Of course he does. God cared so much that we're perishing that he sent his son. See, this is one of the times where we got to remember, what's God's perspective? God's perspective is like, what is it to die by drowning? What about sin? That's much worse in God's eyes. And that's one of those ways where our faith and our fear can be out of order, that sometimes we're more afraid of what people think than we are afraid of being separated from God. We don't necessarily have a healthy enough fear of being separated from God. And so this question, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing, is ultimately answered by God in the fact that he sent his son. Of course God cares that we're perishing. We're not perishing by wind and by waves, by our culture, by our circumstances. People are perishing because of sin. People are perishing because they are rejecting God. And God cares so much that people are perishing that he sent his son to save them. See, how we answer this question says everything about what we think of God. The answer to this question is a resounding, of course. Of course God cares. God cares very much that this world is perishing. And sometimes our perspective is just limited. And it's just in this moment. It's just in a moment when the winds and the seas are overpowering us. But in the long run, God always saves his people. Always. The disciples' question, teacher, do you not care that we are perishing, is an important question to ask. It's one we should ask. It's one we should be honest about. But as I said, there is an answer, and God gives us this answer. And Jesus first demonstrated this answer to his disciples by rebuking the wind and the sea. And God ultimately answers this question by reconciling all of us to God, because there is this connection between our fear and our faith. And this is why we are to have a healthy fear of God, of what he's capable of the power he has over sin, and in raising Jesus over death. And so I invite you at this time to keep in mind the fact that God cares very much when we're perishing. Even in our circumstances, even in our culture, God cares very much. And sometimes our scope is limited, and we can't always see what's coming at the end, but we can rest assured that this is something God cares deeply about. And I invite you at this time not to forget that as you go throughout your week. We also offer an invitation in case you have any needs, if you need prayers, if you need someone to talk to, if there's anything at all that we can do for you, we invite you to talk to us or even come forward now as we'll stand and sing the invitation song.